And now I shall introduce our keynote speaker for this morning. It's Mr. Nicholas Gosling. Nick Gosling is currently the head of St. George Advanced Patient Simulation and Skills Center at St. George University Hospital's NHS Foundation Trust. Nick qualified as an operating department practitioner in 1992 before moving into education in the year 2000, where he successfully designed, implemented, and managed both a best practice clinical skills lab and a fixed and mobile high-fidelity advanced patient simulation center. Nick was part of the original London Deanery Foundation program initiative that in 2003 delivered training to all foundation doctors as a collaborative approach, which still continues today through Health Education South London. In 2011, Nick successfully designed and commissioned his second state-of-the-art multi-simulation and skills suite as a joint project between the St. George University London Medical School and the St. George Healthcare NHS Trust. His last build in 2013 was adding £500,000 dental maxillofacial simulation suite onto the main simulation center, further increasing both teaching space and learning opportunities across a number of surgical specialties. Nick's department currently provides training to over 5,000 healthcare professionals a year, both in the GAP Center in situ simulation and the clinical environment of the trust, and out in the community providing bespoke simulation and skills program for all healthcare practitioners. His latest success has been winning a 3-year tender to partner with the Royal College of Surgeons, providing all surgical and dental educational hands-on courses, while the Royal College rebuilds its facilities in London. Nick regularly presents both in the UK and internationally, and has taken his model of simulation design to a number of countries in Europe, and more specifically in Greece, where he's now training faculty and helping design simulation program facilities for the Hellenic Society of Anesthesiology. Nick, with 2 decades of experience in the design, delivery, and development of educational programs using technology-enhanced learning, is considered both an expert in the field and yet claims himself a novice. For every day, there's something new to learn. Please join me in welcoming Nicholas Gosling.
Thank you very much, Robert, and thank you very much, Amanda, for inviting me here today to share a bit of that time over 2 decades. I feel quite old and after that introduction. But I do still regard myself as a novice, and even yesterday, every time I talk to people, I learn something new, and I question whether I'm actually doing the right thing and I'm leading the department in the right direction. However, today, Amanda asked me to talk about how, if at all, we've integrated into our own trust. For a number of years, we often used to meet people after, say, 10, 12 years of being in St. George's who would say, I didn't even know you had a simulation centre. And I used to think, crikey, how have we got it so wrong? And for years, we played with the analogy of learning lessons and either you get on board with safety or it's going to cost you even more to sort of threaten the management to let us continue doing our work. But there's been a number of small initiatives that have grown and weaved its way into the fabric of the trust that I want to share with you today, that I think have made a huge difference in terms of buy-in and integrating technology-enhanced learning rather than simulation, using technology to enhance the learning and the teaching. We did some work with the Institute of Education to identify exactly what the impact on our learners was over, say, 10 years of foundation simulation. And actually the result that came back was that it had more of an impact on our teachers in patient safety and therefore the organisation than the learners, because they went back to the clinical environment, changed the way that they practiced, which in turn changed the practice of those around them. Bear with me, there we go. So I hope today to talk to you about this unique position of having a simulation centre in a hospital that has management buy-in as well as the shop floor buy-in, and the role of our system and simulation in analysing those needs of the organisation and the local needs which are highlighted by the individuals in their specific clinical environments. How we've embedded our technology, our learning techniques into the institutional learning framework of the trust, and throughout the collaboration and the importance of collaboration and communities of practice that I've had and been lucky enough to still have with my partners at the Sales Centre, Barts, Chelsea, Nottingham, and so forth. One thing to realise is that institutional learning is a bit of an oxymoron, really, because institutes can't learn themselves. They're buildings. So they won't ever learn, and we know that from years of trying to persuade them to change their practices. So the way that it does work, however, is through individuals, the teams, the communities of organised networks, the stakeholders, and the social practices. I think Google did some reviews and studies recently and found that there was more production coming from the discussions around the coffee machine than there were from the meetings that were held in boardrooms. And I think the same can be said with our use of simulation and technology, and where and how we debrief post-simulation. So we've been lucky enough to have this year so far over 3,500 learners, over 1,000 faculty through our centre, doing all sorts of different surgical simulation, mobile simulation skills, and using the technology. However, I was asked to present very late notice, or maybe a day's notice, to the Secretary of Health who visited St George's 3 weeks ago, and I was asked to provide one slide to describe what our department did, which caused me much angst. And we came up with this slide, and I'm going to use this slide throughout the presentation and go through each component about how we got involved with the workforce development, how we use human factors and ergonomic design, policy alignment, and how we remain a learner-centered centre, looking at the learner's needs specifically. Very quickly, my background, as Robert said, is I started in the Postgrad Education Centre, setting up a clinical skills laboratory in 1999, and soon understood the difference in human factors. I came from the theatres as an ODP, where God was the surgeon, and there was a strict hierarchy. I suddenly saw God in a different light when they were in a clinical skills laboratory with fresh coffee. They didn't have a private practice to go to, and they had all the time in the world to talk to the trainees, and therefore the trainees' behaviour changed. They were now asking the questions they should have asked when with a patient directly in front of them. So my colleague and I, Greg McNulty, consultant intensivist, started to design our own simulation using whatever materials we had, which at the time was an ALS 4000. It was a Darth Vader of simulators. All it did was sound like Darth Vader. There was no chest movement. I don't think the pulses worked, but it was a body. So we took that into our centre. We used a bit of Access, which was a very crude anaesthetic simulation program, and tried to run simulations in our centre. And soon realised that it just didn't work with people directly observing straight in front of them. It affected the human factors and so forth. And it wasn't realistic enough at all. So we quickly moved out into the ward in 2001 and started doing it in their normal practice environment, which had huge changes. Running the simulation, debriefing, discussing, and pre-briefing, talking about what we were going to do before we did it as a team. And it was some of the highest fidelity that we've run, and I still use this model. And as Robert said, working in Greece, where the budget for running simulation was a deficit, it had no money at all. And we were able to run recently 3 high-fidelity simulations operating all at the same time with 3 separate viewing areas using £1,000 worth of iPads. And that was all the technology we used for live observation, video playback, sound, and so forth, with humans as the patients. My first simulator, however, was in 2001. This was at the time when the simulators were produced by METI. This is the CEO of METI at the time, Lou Orbanoff, and that's a very young me and my medical director at the time, where we went to the States and spoke to CA METI at the time about purchasing a simulator. And they were very, very interesting. Lou was a real character, and with a broad American accent, he said, yeah, I can sell you a $200,000 simulator, but that's not what you're buying. You're buying family. You're buying family. If you purchase, I don't want to sell you this simulator unless you're going to stay family. And we were like, crikey, what are we going to do here? You know, how's the finance director going to return on this? And it was true. And ever since then, I've known CAE employees, Marco, Amanda, and so forth, and I've grown my community of practice with those that provide simulation. Whether it be bias or not, I believe I've still chosen the right product for the job and the learning needs that I require. We then purchased very quickly an ECS mobile simulator, which wasn't mobile at the time. It had a fixed box, it required power, it required gas, and we made it mobile. We stuck all the technology underneath the patient trolley, and we started to take transfer teams through the hospital and use it as a mobile simulator. And it worked wonders. It meant that the teams could actually operate as they normally would, use the same policy and procedures, and move around the trust. We had huge BBC recording type cameras, which were extremely off-putting, but it allowed us to play back and let the teams self-analyze themselves sometimes. So we let them sit in a room and watch the video themselves to find out what they did well and to identify areas of improvement. My next simulators came between 2000 and 2003, and my first two children were born, Tom and Ollie. And stress levels increased dramatically in my life. We then purchased and built through the charity donation our current laboratory, which again has now changed in 2013 to include a dental simulation unit. And I'm in the process of now building a new dental simulation unit in these two areas and joining the skills lab up to be a high-fidelity surgical training unit. The great thing about this laboratory was the flow. So when we designed it, we thought, how can we maximize flow for larger group participation in simulation, as well as accommodate different groups. So on any day, we run 3 to 4 different courses, or for some of our trust flagship courses, which I'm going to talk about later, we can have up to 40 different learners in 4 separate groups, rotating around wards, outlying patients and intensive care beds throughout the center. And it's really proved to be a fantastic design for us, and one I could fill again tomorrow. It also changed the way that we use simulation. That initially when we started foundation simulation, it was commissioned with one purpose only, to train doctors. Wasn't interested in anything else apart from the doctor's training to be able to upskill them in crisis resource management. So we used to hire in faculty nursing and pay them on a bank shift to stand there with an earpiece in, and we would let them know whether or not they were going to be nice or whether or not they were going to carry out this instruction. It was very false. And eventually, the London Deanery and Stelly started to ask and put in a stipulation about wanting to teach human factors, to give them an understanding of human factors. And that opened it up for us. So we then were able to say the only way we can do this is if we have real nursing staff on board. And this was the first change that we managed to implement in our organization with the heads of nursing and governance and risk, by saying that this is an opportunity, this is a low-hanging fruit. This course is paid for, we have it, it's going to take place. And you can either release your nursing staff to this, or we will get them from another trust. And with that threat, they started to release them. It wasn't a 3-line whip, so sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But we ran for a good sort of 6-7 years with this sort of model, and at times we would manage to get allied health professionals, HCAs, and so forth. With over 20 years, we started to look and decide whether or not this was still high fidelity, whether we still should be using part-task skills, practice and training, and how we mix those lectures into it. And certainly what we've learned from industry is about preloading, So we would send people pre-learning material, get them to visit the website before they arrived, so they knew what they were going to be taking place in, so we could reduce those lectures and they could spend more time in the simulator. And that was certainly where they gave feedback. They wanted more scenarios, they wanted more attempts at this. And at the moment, or certainly before this took place, we were giving people one simulation each, which was really the first time that they'd had it. And we knew that if they went back in again, things would have improved. So we started to ask ourselves, well, is this simulation? Are we a simulation center, or are we a technology-enhanced learning center? Do we use this for rehearsal? Do we use it for testing? And so forth. And the answer was that we used it for all of them. So coming back to my original slide, I'll start with the human factors and ergonomics. We wanted to make sure that we were probing the system, using our mobile simulation troupe to, sometimes unannounced, go in and run simulations, sometimes announced. We would tell them what we were going to do, and we would then feed back to them whether their policy, and they would feed back to us whether their policy and procedures worked, and so forth. We got this idea, however, not on our own. We got this idea through collaborative working with Thomas's simulation team, the sales center, when we produced and wrote a bid to run emergency preparedness in GP surgeries when polysystems were coming out and so forth. And we wanted to run a needs analysis through this HIAC, Health Innovation Education Cluster. The aim of the project was to explore the extent of which primary care practices were ready to deal with medical emergencies. They all had a signing off system that was self-regulated. So for anaphylaxis, they would say, were they prepared for anaphylaxis? And they would tick a box to say yes. Did they have the anaphylaxis kit? Yes. Was everybody aware of the training? Yes. Which meant that they had a syringe with some adrenaline in it, and they had an anaphylactic guideline up on a wall somewhere. But they received funding if they had ticked all these boxes. We soon found out that the truth wasn't really that simple. And they weren't as prepared as they believed. And we also wanted to know, how could we measure that? As opposed to pre and post feedback on confidence and so forth, or one aspect of the learning we were going to look at. We developed a success criteria. So what would success look like at the end of this training program? So this was the first time we started to take our mobile simulation out into the community. We set up mobile cameras using SMOTs or anything. We were rich at the time, or certainly Stelly, the London Deanery were. And we projected images from a GP room. It was all in the same place they would normally do it, with the same nurse. So the anaphylaxis scenario would start with the nurse on her own, giving a flu jab or something to a patient. And we did small group teaching in between, so we upskilled at the same time. And we did this repeatedly over 3 visits. But this was the clever bit that our educationalist produced for us and took, which was a concept of change through action research, or participatory action research, where we went in and we examined the current state. Where were they at initially? We would tell them what scenarios we were going to run. We were going to run an anaphylaxis, an MI, and a pediatric asthma in reception. We would tell them this 3 weeks before we visited. And then we'd come in and we'd run it. We would observe. We would have the peer groups observing as well with feedback forms. And then we would evaluate this. And then we would implement those changes through smart plans, run it again, evaluate, and keep going until we hit the desired effect. And it was interesting because the attitudes were very different at the beginning. At the end, the knowledge was upskilled. The teamwork and the non-technical skills of the team changed, certainly within the non-medical members of this team. Their procedural skills got better. And we suddenly realized that this wasn't what GPs do. 0.8% of their time is emergency care. And yet the public didn't see that. And certainly, if you've been to your GP surgery recently, they look like mini healthcare centres. They're hospitals. But they're not equipped to deal with this. And the ergonomics were dreadful because of that. They had 6 or 7 different bags for their emergency equipment. So we changed all of this through this SMART plan. So we had specific measurable actions, resources, and a time limit to it. And some of these we wrote for them, some of it they wrote. But it was all the team constantly sending the SMART plan back and forth to each other until we could agree on it, put a timeline on it, and then sign it off. And this, therefore, helped us to feed back our developed needs and learning needs analysis through their knowledge, procedural skills, non-technical skills. When we first asked them to fill this out on along with an ARHQ safety climate questionnaire, it was only the GP and the nurse that would fill any of these things out, really. Certainly the receptionist and the manager wouldn't have touched any of the procedural skills or the knowledge about what to do when somebody stopped breathing. But at the end of the session, they all knew about it. They all knew the importance and how they could support the medical practitioners during this emergency, how their knowledge of where the oxygen was and how it connects can also help, and how to know whether it's empty or change a cylinder, etc. So all of these things dramatically improved as an outcome of us identifying the needs through this success criteria, measuring the pre, the post, in situ simulation, identifying those needs, splitting those into different categories, looking at what the training focus would be, and then constantly rerunning this cycle over and over again until we got it right and until the change occurred. We then took this back to our hospital and thought, well, why can't this work in our trust? And started using it on wards that were having difficulties, some that had been identified as difficult wards, some that the matrons themselves came to us and said, is there anything you can do? And rather than saying, yes, we'll fix it, we said, yes, we'll come and we'll run some simulation, standard simulation, and we'll observe, and we'll get your team to observe how you practice yourselves and feedback through this SMART plan, identifying what changes need to be made, what are we doing well, etc. One of them was, most recently, was this high acuity CT scanner in our A&E department. And nobody really wanted us to go in there and to do any training because they were worried that they would need this. This is a high acuity scanner, so when the helicopter lands, it comes straight down into a lift and straight into this CT scanner. So I had to meet with the Board of Governors and so forth and convince them that I would be out within a 3-minute warning. So when the helicopter lands, it would be 3 minutes before that patient would arrive, and I could be out of this environment. So I had the resus team come in and provide a second crash cart for us to wheel in and so forth. But it was the head of radiology that contacted me at first and said, we've got these patients coming in, the team brings them down from the helicopter, and then everybody disappears. Everybody goes off into A&E, which is right next door, whilst the radiology team are with this patient, and we're putting them in the scanner. And often they're going off, and we have a team that aren't that familiar with the equipment and so forth. And I said, well, okay, this is alarming news that you're aware of this. What have you done about this? And they said, well, we're trying to organise training. So we thought the best way to do this would be to go down and run some simulation and then feed that back into the Patient Safety and Quality Board and so forth, and to the radiology department. And as we expected, it turned out to be a nightmare. The patient went into the scanner. We had them experience some change in physiology before arresting. And the equipment and the ergonomics of trying to get the crash trolley even next to the patient, which was in the corner of the room, proved to be difficult enough, let alone knowing what equipment to use. Even though the drawers were all labelled, it's a standardized trolley, there were pediatric pads going onto the mannequin and so forth. So we fed this back to the team. They identified the training they needed. Again, we produced a SMART plan. We looked at the resources that they needed. We put dates of when this had to be completed, and worked with them repeatedly going through this SMART plan until it was fixed. And it's still ongoing. But what we did identify was, and what they have learnt from it, was that they were in charge of their own training and learning needs. And they could use the simulation as a resource, fully or in part or not at all to do this. So they could have case-based discussions and say, look, we've got half an hour, we're not doing anything. Let's imagine that we have this arrest. What's the first thing you're going to do? You. Can you tell us where this is in the drawer, and so forth? So to familiarize them with the protocol procedures and the equipment itself. So the other thing was to map those strengths around the trust and to make educational leads in each area aware of what was available to them and train them. So typically our train the trainer program had been for medical staff who constantly move every 6 months. If we're lucky enough to get the consultants to come on board, great, but the majority were people who were going to be rotating around different trusts. And also to practice this thing called foresight with the local teams, about trying to think ahead, about pre-briefing, and trying to imagine not one outcome, but several potential outcomes that could occur when something goes wrong. So we now take this around the trust and identify areas through consultant engagement, through the Patient Safety Quality Board, which used to be the Safety Committee, which have a different view of simulation now, primarily due to the change in our chief executives. I've had 7 chief executives in my time, and some of them regarded simulation and patient safety as a garage. And depending who was visiting the centre and the dignitaries that were coming, what car they wanted released to show them how wonderful they were, irrespective of what we were doing. We're very lucky at the moment to have Jacqueline Totterdell, who has just completed her first year as our CEO and has been to the Simulator Centre no less than 25 times. I meet with her within every week or 2-week period. I'm fully engaged with the Trust Board, the Board of Governors come through, and so forth. And we have a great interactive relationship. And that's changed how we're allowed to move around the Trust and so forth. So one of the things that we started with was robotic simulation. We have this wonderful robot, the Da Vinci, in urology. Everybody's trained on it, primarily by the company over a sandwich. That's your incentive to go to the training, a sandwich. And they trained you how to use it. They didn't train you, though, how to use it when it went wrong, because it wouldn't go wrong. So the company would have never have given you training on this because it would never have gone wrong. So we took a simulator, we put it in a Da Vinci, and we said that it had gone wrong and we needed to evacuate this patient whilst it was hemorrhaging, and the whole team froze. And we took this video back to the quality board, we showed it to them and said, therefore we want to access to use the Da Vinci, we want to close theatres for a period of time, or whatever your solution is for us to get in. It's your need now. And they allowed us to. So we've now written protocol procedures. We routinely do undocking and docking of patients in emergency from robotic surgery. And back on the wards again, probing the system. This all started in 2005, perhaps, when we started Wombats simulation. We thought we were really clever with the name Wombats. Ward-orientated mannequin-based action training and simulation. It just rolled off the tongue. And when I went to my first HPSN in 2005, which terrified me, this was the World HPSN, where 3,000 healthcare professionals got together, and it was madness. You needed Valium by midday just to take in everything you'd learned and the people you'd met. But the day before we presented, the Times produced an acronym for Wombats, which was a waste of money, brains and time, which really sort of worried us. So we've always kept this Wombats, and since 2005 we even had little Wombat signs, like the floor cleaners. So if we were coming through a transfer, we'd dot these little floor cleaning signs saying Wombats training in progress, and everybody knows what Wombats is now. We had to put it on the side of the mannequins in transfer because the public was so worried about perhaps when we were finished the simulation and we were wheeling the mannequin back that we'd have a sandwich, a laptop on top of the patient, and they would be like, why are you doing this? So we branded it, and we got good uptake. All our programs revolved and were instigated from SIs, critical incidences, near misses and so forth, whether it be blood transfusion, tension pneumothorax and so forth, and pacing. And when we reran the programs, sometimes as a learning needs analysis to see what went wrong, or after education, we still found problems. And then we put our information into Datex. So if somebody went to the chest train kit, which was signed and checked and correct, and we found it was missing something, we filled out a Datex report under simulation, under wombats. And we said, during this training simulation, this occurred. And so we're now producing that SI data under simulation, which feeds back into the system. The programs themselves for the clinical environments were attractive. It takes ownership. It takes some sort of level of cover by the matron, the senior sisters, to be able to run this in their clinical environment. Everybody is too busy. There is no time. There is no space. And yet, when they really want to do something, you can create that time and space. And we're only talking about a few hours to be able to run 2 simulations. And we found using one group rather than 2 separate groups, so everybody just having one go, you'd run your tension pneumothorax or transferring patient scenario, and then you'd feed back, you'd debrief, you'd have them debrief, and then you'd run it again. So that actually they did it properly, and they thought, oh, okay, we've implemented some of these changes, some of the techniques, and that works. And the last thing that they remember is doing it well, and why they did it well. And this is quite important, this feed-forward mental simulation, this foresight training. There's great literature to tell us about this, about how experts, Atwal Gawande has done a lot of research in how experts think and how they use foresight training to engage themselves and better their performance. There's a great video on the YouTube with the blue arrows, the equivalent of the red arrows. And they sit in this room, somewhere in America, in a deep laboratory somewhere, very secure. And they're all sitting in their flight suits. They've got big cups or jugs of coffee. And they're sitting there all casually chatting. And suddenly the flight lead says, okay, let's get it on. Let's have a run through before we go out. And they all turn their chairs around. They all sit in the same formation that they're going to be on the ground and in the air. And they all put their coffee mugs down. They close their eyes. And the lead says, right, okay, let's approach. And we're on takeoff. And they all start to hold an imaginary glosh. And they all have their eyes closed. And they climb to 2,000 feet. And he says, right, we're going to break left 3 Gs. And they all start to move their head at the same time. And depending on the G-force that they remember from their flight, they run through the whole flight. Each time they turn their head, they're grimacing, changes. And they literally are imagining themselves doing this run through. And they go through the whole flight display, and then they come in, they land, and then they open their eyes and say, everybody all right? Any problems? No, good. And they go off and do it. And this is really interesting. So we've always thought that, the scenarios where you learn, and then the debrief is also very important. And there are great models of debriefing to use, the advocacy inquiry, the diamond, and so forth, that all specialize in how to feed out those salient points and learning points. But often we've forgotten about this feeding up and working with the teams. I think certainly in interprofessional education, this idea, this social idea of learning and safety is important. And Hollinger has done some great research on it, that if we talk about what we're going to do and the team have the opportunity to identify any potentials or gaps and what might we do if those occur, what is our threshold for communication, sharing of information, engaging in proactive and preemptive analysis when it comes to thinking about risk and things that could go wrong. So we constantly work around this model, and we're trying to integrate this in, and I'll talk about this in a second, into our ward rounds and board rounds, which often don't use it. So that brings me on to the policy alignment within our organization. Yes, we've had good history of taking cues from the Sequin, CQC audit data, Datex and so forth, the clinical audit, Trust Local Education and Safety Policies, Quality Improvement Academy. DAG is something that's recently started up that we got involved with, which is the deteriorating adult group. Because of our failure to escalate recognized, perhaps on deteriorating adult patients through EWS, early warning scores, and so forth. So we got involved again through Health Education South London. It was a small bid. And we wanted to, again, put into some of the lessons we'd learned with the sales centre into a project called STAR. So it was our safety thermometer and risk or RAG rating response. So we took some of the data of the EWS and I clearly identified. We used to sit in meetings and look at a colour-coded chart of the wards and their return rate of correct scoring of EWS rates. And we'd see these red boxes. And I would always ask the stupid question, you know, what do we do? Is that a problem? And they would say yes. But nobody ever seemed to really discuss it or want to identify it. So we thought, could we use that PAR, that participating action research, this theory, to understand safety climate and engage staff in changing some of these issues. So it was a proactive response to safety risk, incorporating simulation as a learning tool, only as a learning tool, amongst a number of educational activities. It was tailor-made to that specific environment, to that specific problem of perhaps EWS engagement. And it was designed with and for the staff. So it was a bottom-up approach, promoting this safety culture. Some of the problems in identifying these wards and so forth was through the audit data. Not all the audit data lent itself for us to be able to identify it. We would then approach multi-tiered needs analysis, which I'll show you in a second, run feedback workshops. So we had to feed back the results to that organisation and constantly get their buy-in from what we were doing, because they were very threatened by us when we came up. They had already been labelled by our trust as a failing ward and left to be a failing ward. And they didn't really feel that. And certainly when we went up there, they were all exceedingly keen to do the right thing at the right time for the right patient. So what was going on? So we did another ARHQ with them to identify their perceptions in safety, their policy procedures. We shadowed staff to observe current practices and systems. So I had a couple of simulation fellows who would spend days doing pedagogy studies and looking at how people communicated to each other. We had a staff suggestion box, just in case we missed it, an anonymous suggestion box. You tell us what you think's going on. Nobody will get access to this information apart from us. And that was exceedingly interesting. We ran multi-team simulations to evaluate their use of the resources, the policy and procedures, and again, fed that back to the team. So we used an activity model that is part of the change laboratory and identified the tools, the subjects, our rules, the community of practitioners, the division of labour, where was all this work coming from, where was it going to, etc. We had to identify the local needs, and they had to accept buy-in for this to work. So the matron, the consultants, identified to lead in that change, had to be. And we fed this back through the deteriorating adult group, and we said this has to be policy. If they don't accept this, if they don't want to take it up, there's no point doing it. It won't work. So the themes that we identified very quickly were the communication and handover. Nobody was asking the obvious questions. There were two types of communication and handover, one nursing, one medical. And everybody simply gave information. Whether or not it was received, neither team really knew whether it was, because nobody was feeding back that communication. There were different communities of practice working in parallel rather than in tandem. Speaking up was very difficult because of the hierarchies and roles. The ward rounds were being led by very junior doctors. It wasn't always interprofessional, the ward rounds, so some of the key people weren't always there. And it certainly wasn't keeping in with best practice, but it was taking place. Hence, we had this poor EWS scoring and so forth. The resources, well, we needed people, we needed buy-in, technology. facilities and senior supports, which again we got through the DAG group, who report straight to the chief exec and to the medical director. So the interventions we changed, I'll go through these separately. We rewrote their ward safety checklist, which included different elements of safety, which were all taken from the Royal College of Physicians. This wasn't new. The safer approach. So most of this was going on in other hospitals, which was quite alarming that we found out that we already had this as a resource in our own hospital that we didn't know about, that some wards in our own hospital had something like this, and safer and so forth. So we got them to fill this in. This was on their ward checklists, and who was there, the introductions, the pre-round checklists, the timeouts for each patient, and as a team what they were doing. And on the back of it we had the safer bundle on the back, which again should have been rolled out within the trust and our organisation, which this ward had never heard of. So we redesigned all our communication handovers. Some of this came back from our feedback exercises, where we asked the medical teams and the nursing teams to sit in a room for 5 minutes with us and have a chat. And it soon became clear that the duty doctors going off on the day shift would hand over to the doctors by an email or writing, but not to the nursing staff. The nursing staff would have their handover to their nursing staff, never the two men, which we couldn't understand. And when we asked them that simple question, would it be useful for you to have had read each other's reports, they went, oh yeah, very, really useful. So we instigated it. We said this has got to happen then. So this handover initiating across the team. Monthly meetings between the ward and the clinical leads and the nursing leads to take place, so that people could constantly keep asking the obvious questions and bringing up their own solutions. Changing their checklists on the ward rounds, we've talked about. The consultant rotas, so we had to again get buy-in from the medical director, because the reason the junior doctors were doing the ward rounds is because the consultants had clinics. Okay, well, we've got to change that. Do you want a consultant to be on that ward round and achieve best practice according to the guidelines you're setting? They said yes. I said, well, therefore, you have no option. You'll have to redesign their time in clinics and so forth, which they did, amazingly, to meet this. And I think that was part of the power of investigation and feedback and obtaining the results that we did and giving that to the trust board, that they had no choice, really. Recognition and escalation of care, the practice nurse educators, the sepsis educators, all our sequin buy-in staff were involved with that. And we had Obstober, where we just focused with a hard team of practice nurse educators on EWS scoring and supporting. So every day there would be at least 2 or 3 practice nurse educators in this ward assisting people with EWS, which is predominantly done initially by the healthcare assistant and then passed on. So we really hit it hard between October and then sepsis in November and so forth. And we had the doctor's office. We found problems with the Wi-Fi, the wireless on wheels. So they didn't have Wi-Fi, so they couldn't share their OBS across the Cerner system, because the Wi-Fi on wheels wasn't connecting to the Wi-Fi and so forth. They had logged calls with IT, but IT had a much bigger problem, which was the whole of the hospital that they were trying to deal with. So, lots of changes, but predominantly because of the work that we did and the groups that we sat in, so feeding into this deteriorating adult green, this work stream governance really made the difference for us in terms of making change. We had identified what needed to change, but it was having these people in a room that we reported to, and we were quite separate from everybody. So we had just really gone in there and performed some learning needs analysis. And this is the results we found. These are the discussions that we had, and these are the recommendations that have come from the clinical teams in that environment. And it subsequently became part of the Patient Safety and Quality Board, our CQC response, and the objective was set then for 0 in-hospital avoidable cardiac arrests, by promoting ward-based learning across the trust. So we had taken our STAR project, and now the board had said we want this disseminated out across the trust wide to all the wards by deploying a mobile education troop to support local tailored needs, analysis, action planning, and so forth. So we kind of felt a bit worried because we'd got what we wanted, but now they threw the whole lot at us. And we weren't quite sure how we were going to do this, but we were going to collaborate with the QI network and the stream. But we also had the data, the important data. So the blue line is our 222 calls across, this is from 2016 up to month by month, 2016 up to September 2017. So we started this project in 2016, and this is the beginning and the end of the project for STAR and dissemination across 15 wards. The blue line, 222 calls. The green line is peri-arrest calls, and the red line is cardiac arrest calls. So as a number of educational initiatives of which we were part of, simulation was part of, we have reduced the cardiac arrest calls and increased the peri-arrest calls. So people are identifying sicker patients quicker. So the deteriorating adult group, to a certain extent, was doing the job that they were asked to do. So moving on into learner-centered focus. To support flourishing individuals with continual professional education, develop skills and feedback giving and so forth. Really for us, probably our most successful group of individuals and enthusiasts have come from the obstetrics and gynecology division. Today we've got Polly Hughes, who was one of the founders of mobile education in obstetrics, where they are now running through simulation, part-task trainers, weekly activities in their obs and gynae department and labour ward. They've got CNST recommendation, CMAC recommendation. They've introduced mandatory HDU study days and produce a report every time they deliver. Each month and each session, they produce this report of training and education for action in maternity. So much so that the level of requirement from my department is simply to provide resource for them now, whether that be mannequin, whether that be iPads. They don't need technicians, they don't need specialists in debriefing, they don't need video analysis, they don't need any human support, they just need the equipment. So they've just purchased the latest Lucina. Before that they were using Noel. And each month they would go out and either identify risk that they've come across, that there are issues with hemorrhaging and so forth, or they just repeat the training around shoulder dystocia, postpartum hemorrhage, cord eclampsia and so forth, and routinely produce the report with the comments, the desired action, the observed, what did we observe, what did their peer groups observe, what were the comments, who was involved, and what the take-home messages were. So we have all the data from them about who was trained, where they were trained, and so forth. To the extent where our Noel broke and we didn't have the mannequin, and Polly and the team were using part-task equipment, if they didn't receive a simulation within that week, people started to bother Polly and say, why haven't we had any training this week? So this is probably our best practice example of individual departments and local expertise running mobile education for themselves. So to increase that and to increase the mobile education troop, we had to train a different group of people. We needed to train our practice nurse educators, perhaps not in the same way that we trained our medical faculty in our standard simulation train the trainer programs. This was how to get them to take a mannequin of their own. So they start the day of their train the trainer with 4 mannequins dressed as civilians in a in wheelchairs or chairs, and they need to put them into a trolley, put them in a hospital gown, turn them on, input the physiology, and so forth, all through these action cards. And our team aren't allowed to interact with them at all. So they all have to take them to a room. We're allowed to be in the corridor of our department. If they need help, they have to come and find us. Again, this is something our educationalist pointed out, that if we kept them going in there, if we saw them in trouble and went in there and started to help them out, we stopped their learning, and they could actually figure it out themselves. So we really specialized in how they worked with the technology, how they used their technology. We helped them with scenario design, so before they come, they're asked to think of a problem in their clinical environment and what they want to change about it, and we help them write a small mobile simulation scenario. And what we know from that was that the financial restrictions severely reduced the opportunities for non-mandatory study days. So the first budget to be cut is predominantly nursing, whilst this medical budget continues. SimCenter access and SimCenter based interprofessional training is difficult to do outside of our foundation, core medical training and medical school simulation, because you're taking complete teams out of an environment and it's exceedingly expensive. Also, our SimCenter is bursting full, so we had to come up with a new strategy. The commitment and the sustainable healthcare providers that we were training in simulation, as I said earlier, weren't and aren't the medical side of it. Very few of our consultants have been through the train the trainer, but lots of our SPRs and so forth have, which are all rotating. So the nursing staff were the perfect group for us to get with this program. So our mobile simulators now are used very differently. We have I'd hate to say it, but we do have a garage now of mobile simulators. We're almost like Avis, rent-a-car. You rent a simulator. We have a form on our website that the PNEs just simply fill out, and it's booked. And we have them sitting there, lined up, just like Apollo here, sitting with their bag of goodies. And in each bag, they've got their controller monitor, their physiology monitor, the chargers, and an iPad startup guide. And I'm about to see if we can go to that now. So I'll switch over to this. So again, this is fantastic. Gary, our new technology expert, our technologist in the audience, came up with this idea of using these iPads. So often the problem was interfacing with the lots of different electrical equipment for the practice nurse educator. We wanted to make it as simple as possible so they could get on with it. They could turn the mannequin on and so forth, but then this whole business of relationship physiology with another monitor. And we have SimMon. Have you all seen SimMon on the iPads? A simple physiology you can control from one iPad to another iPad. So when we were doing simple EWS or deteriorating patient, it wasn't complex simulation. We wanted a mannequin that could breathe, that could respond, that had pulses, and with physiology they could control. So we used to use a lot of the iPads, and Gary came up with this idea of putting iBooks on the iPad with a startup guide. So if I took out Apollo, wrong way, let me just go to the beginning of him. They would open up their Apollo iPad guide, and it would immediately take them through very quick 5 steps of how to start this mannequin up if they'd forgotten, or if there was something that was wrong. And each bit, now we didn't design this, CAE designed this. We just took the photoshops from their big file of how to operate this complex simulator, and they are exceedingly complex, and simplified it into a few slides that they could manage, and how to turn on various bits on them. If they were using the Touch Pro, if they would shut down instructions, closing the thing, and so forth. And also, the last thing was who to contact, how to contact people if they needed to get access. So all our simulators are on the iPad, so it doesn't matter which simulator they take out or which iPad, because it's on iBooks. We'd be happy to share that with you if any of you use, well, I'm sure we have most simulators. We only have one Lairdell. So, okay, welcome. Thank you very much. So here are our simulators. So these are all pretty much mobile except for our 2 high fidelity or 3 high fidelity which stay in the lab. So we have 2 HPS high fidelity mannequins and 1 HPS high fidelity child. All the others are waiting or out and about or permanently out and about. Certainly our new Lucina will only be used with Polly and her team. Before she would share that, we would use that mannequin for other things. We've identified the expertise there, so that will be purely used for that area. We support our practice nurse educators through our website, where we place all their scenarios. Every time they design a scenario, we upload it. We put down who the faculty are, all their scenarios, so other members of the practice nurse education team can take those scenarios. And again, we'd be happy to give you access to all of that. So it's all on our website. It's all there's no password to get into this sort of thing. All we ask for is that if you use anything, let us know what you think of it. If you change it, more importantly, let us know why you've changed it, because we presumably need to change it ourselves then. So we're really keen with that. What's the difference to the organisation? Well, in 4 months last year, when we're collecting our data, this is 5 practice nurse educators' contribution to mobile simulation. So 294 people benefited from 5 practice nurse educators outside of the simulation centre. So no cost at all involved, all done in their workplace. And 220 over the last 5 months from 6 PNEs. February and March, clearly low because of the winter pressures and so forth, but all very, very well resumed. How else do we probe the system? Very quickly, we create some videos. We run fire evacuation exercises for all our critical care environments and so forth. And now they do it on their own. So they pick up our mannequin, our audio-visual kit. And this was, I'll just come to this. This was produced by General Intensive Care all by themselves. As you can see, they had fun doing this. And I think that's half of the key, ownership and enjoying it.
Guys, can I get some help, okay? Please, 11. Trina, would you be able to run to the store and get some oxygen for me? Maybe like one big cylinder, not 2, if you can, please. Okay, no. Are we okay? You're going to, she's going to bring you up the bag. You're going to bring.
So they added their own notations on the bottom, their observation of how long things took, but this was a collective. So this wasn't done by one observer. These comments that they've added to the end were from the whole team. So they all had to agree on that. And then they decided that doing this at double time would be more interesting. So they did some self-analysis before they kept the video. Now they have the video as a training resource on their unit for anybody to look at. And it goes all the way through to transferring the patient to the other ward. They made some mistakes. They went towards the fire. The person leading it didn't realize which ward was where because they were new to the trust, so they went the wrong way initially. And then they come to the lifts. They spent a lot of time at the lifts, not calling a lift, wondering why the lift wasn't coming, but nobody had asked for it, and so forth. Docking the patient in to the new bay, which weren't expecting them actually, and had a huge thing in the way. There were people delivering stuff, so it took them another 3 minutes to get into the bay because everything was in the way. So all of this was really useful, but it was theirs to keep. They designed it, and so forth. So I've just got to finish off now very quickly on the last bit, which is workforce development. So how do we tie all this in? Well, we're really lucky that through this educational troupe of practice nurse educators and taking the success of the STAR project, engaging clinical nursing teams, we were able to engage with the nursing educators. So our Band 5 development pathway for the acute community contains simulation. So they have various things they're going to do. One of them in their first year is harm-free care, which is run in the simulation centre. And the second bit is that in year 2, as a potential shift leader, a Band 5 nurse, you will go through the Meerkats program. So very quickly, I need to explain the Meerkats program. This is our managing emergencies, evaluation response, keeping attention to team communication and patient safety. We have a fixation with animals. We have about 30 different animals for our courses. So this was, again, a big game changer for us. So we had our medical emergency 5th year medical school simulation course, foundation simulation, and core medical training simulation course. And what we did was made them all exactly the same courses that had to, by policy, by the Patient Safety Quality Board, according to the CQC feedback and guidelines, had to contain nurses, shift leaders, HCAs, medical and nursing students on the medical course, but also the faculty had to be made up of doctors and nurses. So the PNEs had to be released to come and teach, to give feedback, because doctors giving feedback to nurses didn't always work, and it wasn't interprofessional. So it started with just like any other day, really. In our skills lab, we had 3 patients in beds. We had 2 outlying or high acuity patients in the simulation rooms, and the teams would rotate around. They would have to be mixed with F1, F2 nurse and HCA, and they would work around through the day seeing these different environments. So they would have over 7 patients. It would start with a board round, just like any other board round. But we gave them specific questions to look at and to answer in their groups of doctors, senior, junior doctor, senior nurse, junior nurse, HCA. We asked them to look at their board round of patients, and we gave them half an hour to conduct this and then feed back to each other about how they were going to manage the day, and then went through the program. This is we hope, the education spiral of learning. So we've mixed all our mainstay courses with our internal needs and our workforce, and it's had great uptake. We have over 225 working hours of the practice nurse educators just on this program alone, and the knock-on effect is it's gone back to those clinical environments where they're familiar with the terminology, they're familiar with learning in groups, they're familiar. One of the questions we got asked by an HCA after a ward round simulation was, I didn't realize that I could talk to the doctor. An HCA didn't think that they were allowed to talk to the doctor, and this is an HCA from a clinical environment. So it's really breaking down the barriers. We can see the numbers of medical, nursing, faculty we've had, and the CCLP, the critical care liaison practitioners that we have on the program. We can identify the wards that they've come from and where the wards aren't. So those DNAs, those wards that aren't coming, go straight to the heads of nursing for feedback. It's all part of our Quality Improvement Academy now, and we're working with them and our deteriorating adult patients group This is the participants we've had in April 17 to 18. 3,600 odd participants and over 1,107 faculty, broken down from medical, nursing, and so forth. But more importantly is our percentage of internal versus external. Internal is still our biggest and what we are interested in. The only reason I have an external course is to pay for everything. So ever since I started the centre, I've worked on a cost-neutral business model. So everything that we make is to pay for all the internal training for free. So my worst case scenario is that it doesn't cost the trust anything. The best case scenario is that I give them my underspend. So I have no budget, I income generate the budget to pay for my staff, the technology, and all the internal training for free by using 36% of external charging. That's it, really. Ever since then, time has flown by. I seem to be a father of 3 now. One of them's Ginger. I don't know how this happened. Maybe this whole father thing that you were talking about has come back. I would love to engage with you. I would like to share everything that we have with you, all our scenarios, anything that you want. We'd love to give it to you. All we would like is feedback on how this is used. So please get in touch. You can have a look at our website. We have resources there, training packages that are being used across the country in different areas. Thank you very much. Come and see me in the afternoon workshops or in the breaks if you have any questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was really impressive. I mean, you can really tell how the UK is really at the forefront of simulation. They've been going at it for about 20 years. And I think this is a great example of that. And for me, if anything is a takeaway of the presentation, is the slide you chose to present. There's not the word simulation on there. So it's back to what Bryn was saying yesterday, what Robert was saying earlier today. Simulation is becoming part of improvement of patient safety, becoming part of improvement of learning. But it's not just about simulation, it's about where it fits. So the terminology on that one slide is terminology that the rest of the hospital understands, which is why they would actually accept simulation to be part of a tool. If you come there with a story about simulation, they probably won't get it. But if you talk that language, they will get it. So what Nick and the team have put together in the last 20 years, I think is incredible. It's a lot of work, a lot of organization. It was packed with information. So I'm sure you have a lot of questions, but unfortunately we don't have time for questions now. But Nick is here the rest of the day, as I believe his colleague is, so he will be able to answer questions. So again, thank you, Nick. The next session will start at 11, so slide change. We'll start at 11 to give you a bit of time for coffee and tea, so we have a bit more time to network and maybe ask some questions to Nick. Thank you very much.